Morning and welcome. On behalf of the Gulf International Forum, thank you for joining us for this timely discussion, confronting and containing the GCC's delicate balance with Iran. It's really difficult to imagine a moment when this topic has been more urgent or with greater fear of consequences. In the weeks before the recent conflict, the Gulf states were clear and consistent. They urged restraint. They understood that a direct U.S. and Israeli war with Iran would not remain contained. They understood that Iran would not respond symmetrically. They had been warned that the consequences would not fall on Washington or Tel Aviv, but on them. And yet, this is precisely what happened. Iran's retaliation struck at the Gulf's economic lifelines, energy infrastructure, and the flow of commerce through the Strait of Hormuz. The consequences of a war that the Gulf states did not want and did not start. We now find ourselves in a tense and unstable equilibrium. A ceasefire without resolution, the most important maritime choke point under pressure, a broader strategic stalemate, and frankly pessimistic views on how this ends. Recent GCC meetings themselves reflect both the severity of the attacks and the difficulty of forging a unified response. For the Gulf states, this is not a distant geopolitical contest. It's immediate, it's at home, structural and permanent. Iran is not a problem that can be eliminated. It's a neighbor that must be managed today, tomorrow, for decades, if not centuries to come. It will not move from there. And yet the central paradox remains. The GCC depends on the United States for its security, but in this case, that same relationship has exposed it to significant risk. Decades of strategy aimed at avoiding entanglement in a U.S.-Iran conflict have been overtaken by events. This leaves the Gulf states navigating an exceptionally difficult and narrow path between deterrence and dialogue, between reliance and autonomy, and perhaps, between each other. We have a number of questions that we need to explore today. Is the GCC still acting as a coherent strategic bloc, or are we beginning to see divergence, particularly the more assertive posture of the United Arab Emirates and the mediation efforts of Oman and Qatar? What does containment of Iraq actually mean under current conditions? Can it be achieved without continuous escalation? How should the Gulf states reassess their security relationship with the United States after an episode that has made them more vulnerable, not less? Can the GCC realistically pursue a two-track strategy, maintaining U.S. protection while reopening channels with Tehran, or has that balance broken down? What role remains for regional mediation? And do Oman and Qatar still have the space to operate effectively? And finally, is there any plausible path forward that restores stability to the Strait of Hormuz without conceding strategic leverage to Iran? These are not abstract questions. They go directly as to whether the Gulf can shape its own strategic environment, or must it continue to absorb the consequences of decisions made elsewhere. I look forward to a candid and substantive discussion between some remarkably qualified experts that we have brought together today. Dr. Ebtesam AlKetbi is the founder and president of the Emirates Policy Center. She is also a professor of political science at the United Arab Emirates University between 2014 and 2024. She served as a member of the Consultative Commission of the Gulf.
That's enough, Ambassador. That's enough for me.
That's enough. All right. Dr. Ali Vaez, I'd not had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Ketbi until today. Dr. Ali Vaez is Crisis Group's Iran Project Director and Senior Advisor to the President. He led Crisis Group's efforts in helping to bridge the gaps between Iran and the P5+1 that led to the landmark 2015 nuclear deal. He has served as Senior Political Affairs Officer in the UN Office of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Iran Project Director at the Federation of American Scientists. He teaches at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Dr. Zeidon Alkinani is a Middle East political analyst and founding director of the Perspectives Institute. He also taught at Georgetown in Qatar and the University of Aberdeen. He leads strategic initiatives in Qatar's educational nonprofit sector. So, round one, Dr. Ebtesam, after the recent attacks on Gulf states, is the UAE more likely to pursue a strategy of containment through stronger military deterrence and security partnerships, or will it resume diplomacy and economic engagement after the end of the war?
Well, thank you for having me. Uh, Ambassador, the key question is not whether the UAE will choose between deterrence and diplomacy. The real question is how it will reorder the relationship between the two after the recent Iranian attack. And the answer is quite clear. The UAE is not shifting from diplomacy to deterrence. It is sequencing them. Deterrence first, and diplomacy second, and economic engagement only under conditions of restraint. This reflects fundamental lesson from the attack. Openness without protection is vulnerability. First, deterrence will now form the foundation of UAE strategy. The attack exposed a critical reality. Even a high capable and globally integrated state like the UAE remains vulnerable if its infrastructure can be targeted at relatively low cost. So the response will not be symbolic, it will be structural. I mean, we should expect a significant strengthening of air and missile defense system, deeper intelligence and early warning integration with key partners, expanding maritime security coordination, particularly around the Strait of Hormuz, and border effort to harden critical infrastructure, including digital and financial system. This is what we can call deterrence by denial, making it operationally difficult for Iran to repeat such attack. At the same time, there will be deterrence by entanglement, embedding the UAE more deeply within international security networks so that any future attack carries wider consequences. Second, diplomacy will continue, but without illusion. The UAE is not in a position to disengage from Iran. As you said in the beginning, Ambassador, geography alone makes that impossible. But the function of diplomacy has changed. Before the war, engagement with Iran was about reducing tension and building confidence. After the war, it becomes about preventing miscalculation, setting clear boundaries, and managing escalation risk. If I put it in another word, I would say diplomacy is no longer a substitute for security. It is a tool to stabilize it. Channel will remain open directly or through mediators, but they will operate under a different logic communication without strategic trust. Third, I would say, perhaps most importantly, economic engagement will become conditional. The UAE cannot fully decouple from Iran. It is a trading state in a tightly interconnected region, but future economic ties will be more selective, more regulated, and crucially more reversible. This introduced a new principle into UAE policy. There is no economic normalization without security restraint. In practice, this means that trade and financial flows will increasingly be elevated, not only in evaluated not only in economic terms, but in security terms. So before the attack, the UAE pursued a strategy of de-escalation to enable stability. After the attack, the strategy becomes deterrence to protect stability and diplomacy to manage it. That's a subtle but decisive shift. I will conclude with saying that the UAE is not abandoning diplomacy, nor it's moving towards open confrontation. What is doing is redefining the conditions under which de-escalation is possible. Stability from an Emirati perspective is no longer preserved by reducing tensions alone. It must be actively protected, enforced, and when necessary, defended. And that's likely to define the UAE approach to Iran in the post war period. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ebtesam. I noted very clearly that two names did not come up in your discussion. One was the United States, and the other was Israel. How would they fit into the diplomacy of the United Arab Emirates? The UAE is the only country in the Gulf that has what I would call a dynamic relationship with Israel. And the United States, of course, has been the paramount giant in the region. Do they fit greater, lesser importance in the UAE diplomacy in the future?
Ambassador, don't forget, UAE wasn't the first one who had a relation with Israel. Qatar opened a business office. Oman opened
Right.
a business office. Then, after, who signed agreement was also Bahrain in the Gulf. It's not only UAE, but this is a strategic decision. Now, diplomacy with Iran has nothing to do with that. We had that relation. We had that our embassy in Tehran. At the same time, we having our relation with Israel. So with US, I think US is indispensable factor in the Gulf. It's not only for UAE, it's for all the Gulfs, and it should. Yes, US was the with Israel whom they started that war, and they didn't consult with the Gulfs, but also both of them, they participated in defending some of the Gulf countries. I mean, for US, of course, all of them has been defended by US in terms of defense system, or even avoiding some attacks on behalf, or intercepting some missiles in some countries.
Thank you. Going on, Dr. Zeidon, how do you expect the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar to position themselves toward Iran after this recent there's more escalation barely describes it? Are they likely to adopt a more confrontational, deterrence-based posture, continue balancing security concerns with diplomatic engagement, and or how would that balance come out, and what factors will shape that choice, in your opinion?
Thank you, Ambassador, and many thanks to the Gulf International Forum for organizing this. I think this is if we were to assume that there is a choice only between confrontation and diplomacy, I think it's a bit more complex than that. The war perhaps has ended the old model entirely. For decades, GCC states, in different ways, of course, as well sometimes, managed Iran through a calibrated hedging, which is sometimes prepared deterrence, but also protection plus dialogue simultaneously. So if we were to look at what this means or how this were to continue through the 2026 escalation this year, with Iran striking Gulf civilian and energy infrastructure, that kind of made that ambiguity a bit untenable and difficult. Now, I think the real question isn't simply if it's a confrontation or diplomacy. It's what comes after this type of hedging. Now, Saudi Arabia, in a different way, may be moving towards a more explicit deterrence posture, but obviously this shouldn't be confused with a desire for open conflict, especially considering the improved relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, particularly since 2020 or 2021. Now, Riyadh was briefly seen as part of this new deterrence ideological camp, alongside with the UAE, which is more towards that rationale. And it is expected for the UAE to have such a response and a reaction, given that most of the attacks threatened its own security and were attacked and targeted towards it. Riyadh and the UAE is also shaped by years of Houthi missile and drone strikes on its critical infrastructure, and it always views the Houthi group as part of Iran's proxy network in the region. And obviously those strikes made Saudi threat perceptions very domestic, much more closer to them. But also, Saudi position has to be understood that it would likely involve credible threat signaling and also pushing for a unified GCC defense architecture, including air and missile defense coordination. And this is also a common consensus that has been growing amongst the different GCC polities recently. But Riyadh will also stop short of direct military confrontation. It lobbied against the US-Israeli strikes before they happened and its interest in reshaping the threat environment, not inheriting the conflict alongside its other GCC partners. Saudi, alongside Egypt and Turkey and Pakistan, was also amongst the countries that were pushing for the Islamabad talks. Qatar and Kuwait would be closer to the diplomacy camp, alongside Oman. Qatar has been known for sustaining engagement with Tehran despite the regional tensions, but it also hosts Al Udeid US airbase, which ironically makes it a target regardless of its diplomatic posture with Iran. Kuwait has also historically played, obviously, a mediating role, as we all know. Both Kuwait and Qatar will continue to prioritize de-escalation and preserve back-channel communication. But Iran's decision to target Gulf states as US, quote-unquote, US facilitators, or as part of the pretext of US influence or interest, made this position really difficult and costly. Engagement with Tehran in any way is no longer cost-free. So there could be an expectation, and Qatar and Kuwait was very open about it and vocal, that they were to maintain their diplomatic identity, but also tightening security coordination with the GCC, which indicates how this conflict has allowed the GCC to readdress how to unify their objectives, given that they might have short-term differences in objectives and how to deal with the war, but in the long term, it will definitely, or has to, make them closer together, given that this has reflected more than ever how unified and collective their existential security is. There is also an evident central paradox, which is this GCC recognition of an existential threat. But of course, responses in the short term, as previously discussed, could be fragmented. This fragmentation is also a thing that Iran benefited from, particularly during the 2017 to the 2021 Gulf Rift, where Qatar's isolation deepened its economic ties with Tehran, and that in itself strengthened Iran's relations with Qatar and also Oman. But I think finally, 3 points or 3 variables that will definitely determine where each state lands is the US reliability, which looks at the muted US response to the 2019 Aramco strikes, and the Iran next move. If Iran continues targeting Gulf infrastructure under the rationale of striking US interest, even the countries in the GCC that have preferred diplomacy first will probably have their instinct hardened. And finally, an institutional momentum, where we've even noticed that a very strong, prominent political elite Gulf voices have publicly called for a more cohesive Gulf framework that would perhaps translate into stronger crisis coordination mechanisms, and also whatever constrains unilateral postures, and ensure that it nudges all GCC states towards a common baseline.
Thank you, Doctor. I just one quick question. One tendency in the GCC that was concerning me. I actually was chargé d'affaires at the embassy in Abu Dhabi and attended the first social event of the first GCC at the time of the creation of the GCC. There was increasing friction, stronger than friction, I would say, between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And now the Abu Dhabi has just announced that the UAE is withdrawing from OPEC, which is seen largely as a Saudi creation. How do you see this? I'm not asking for predictions on where we're going, but how does it? Do you see this in the short to medium term as affecting the cohesion of the council?
It will definitely impact it, but we also have to keep in mind this isn't the first time where we witness different approaches amongst the different GCC states. When we do expect a unified GCC collective framework, we can't undermine and not recognize that these different states can have their own unique characteristics and approaches and interests in different foreign policies and different geopolitical actions, or in different ways of how to engage with the same regional ally or partner or neighbor in the region. I think these diversities amongst the different GCC states do not necessarily always translate into permanent divisions. There are more commonalities, there are more common interests, there are more common objectives that unify them than the different interests and objectives that would divide them. They will always go through clashing opinions, always go through clashing interests, but the reality is eventually, by the end of the road, they will all meet for the betterment of the region. After all, the GCC countries are much more deeply, institutionally and culturally and politically and geographically connected, and these connections are way above their differences. Each GCC state has its own right to carry its sovereign foreign policies, its sovereign decisions. At several times, they can also disagree. The GCC in itself, if we were to compare it to the European Union was never innocent from major differences and divergences that did exist and erupt even following Brexit, with the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. But there is still fundamental frameworks that will unify them. And despite the unfortunate consequences that did erupt from the Iran 2026 war towards the existential security of the GCC, there's a very great opportunity for them to reassess and revisit a lot of coordination frameworks that will eventually make their relationships and make their institutional arrangements stronger than or prior to the war.
Thank you. Ali, I just really reread the question I'm about to ask you, and I've come to the conclusion that it's probably the most difficult question I'm going to pose and may have no answer. How is Iran likely to manage relations with the Gulf states in the future, particularly the principal ones involved, Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, and the Kingdom, the ones most affected by Iranian attacks? Will Tehran pursue reassurance and diplomacy, or will it double down on coercive pressure as a tool of regional violence? And I'm not going to ask, when do you think this might happen?
Great. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for the invitation. It's also a pleasure to be on with Dr. Zeidon and Dr. Ebtesam. Look, it's very difficult, as you said, to predict where Iranian policy will exactly land, but there are certain things that we can foresee at this moment. And I talk about some uncertainties towards the end of my remarks. What I think is certain is that Iran's relation with each of the Gulf states would be a factor of, number one, its threat perception. And that threat perception is measured directly vis-a-vis the posture that these countries have towards the US-Israeli axis. So clearly, the more they side and the more they're closer to with US and Israel, the more threats Iran would perceive from these countries. And clearly, this is no longer a theoretical setup for the Iranians. They believe that they have seen the clear evidence of these countries' territories, airspace, being used for acts of aggression against Iran, and therefore to have basically to host hostile bases towards Iran is something that obviously would be very difficult for the Iranian regime to tolerate. The second thing that I would say is important is that it has now obtained a coercive tool of leverage that it is not going to give away easily. This is primarily, and I'm talking here, of course, about the control over the Strait of Hormuz. This is primarily driven by an economic consideration. Of course, the Iranian regime does not want to survive a hot war to then freeze in a cold peace, in the sense that it's so cynical of the prospect of getting sanctions relief, reliable sanctions relief from the United States, that it sees the possibility of tolling through the Strait of Hormuz as one of the only means of having enough revenue to recover from this war and reconstruct. Now, this is not necessarily seen from the Iranian perspective as a zero-sum situation, in the sense that it is willing to share a new framework for managing the traffic through the strait with its southern neighbors in the Gulf. It doesn't need to be a one-sided control, but nevertheless, it is very unlikely to give that tool away. It also, in the same category of coercion or deterrence, it has demonstrated now that it is willing and able to attack all of its neighbors, regardless of the proximity it has in terms of diplomatic relations, in terms of the mediation work that they had done. The threat perception is driven, as I said, by the US presence and the US Israeli operations against them, whether in the realm of intelligence collection or missile defense system coordination or offensive operations against them. And there is also, I think, we're going to see an effort to decouple financially from the UAE and maybe create new connections and restructure financial connections that Iran has elsewhere, including potentially with countries that Iran has a closer relationship with, like Oman, or completely pivoting away from the region and for Hong Kong to become the new Dubai as a financial hub for the Iranians. So all of this, I think we will see a degree, the exact balance of it depends obviously on where things are standing when the dust settles. And there are now a few factors that I would just outline very quickly that are going to affect some of these calculations, but are uncertain at this point. Number one is the question of fragmentation among the GCC states. Obviously, if we see a situation in which you see deeper ruptures between major countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, that would be highly beneficial to the Iranians. The more cohesion exists between the GCC in terms of their defensive strategy, their policy towards Iran, their policy towards the United States and Israel, the more difficult it would be for Iran to drive a wedge between these countries. But the more fragmentation exists, the more beneficial this would be for the Iranians. And at this stage, it's hard to really predict for certain whether we would see the status quo GCC in the aftermath of this war, a more unified GCC or a more divided GCC. Another key factor here is the great power competition. It is now quite possible that Russia and China would start looking at Iran in the same way that the Europeans ended up looking at Ukraine, a weaker country that managed to stand its ground towards a much more powerful aggressor, which could potentially have utility in the future as a bulwark against that adversary. So with minimal support, China and Russia have been able to once again bog down the United States in the Middle East and sap its power, given the amount of ammunition that the US has spent in defending itself, its allies, and Israel in the region. And that would have a factor in terms of would affect Iranian threat perception, would affect how they would hedge their bets on both sides of the Gulf. Because I think one of the things that also was proven to Russia and China, and might not have immediate implications, but will have medium to long-term implications, is that how much the southern shores of the Gulf are basically the territory of the United States. And if they want, especially a country like China wants to reassure that it has energy security in case of a confrontation with Iran, with the United States down the road, Iran is probably the only state that it can count on. And the final thing, which is again an unknown at this point, is the balance of power internally in Iran. Who's going to prevail? Who's going to end up on the top? For now, we have a good guess, but this war is not over. We might have additional high-level political decapitation before the dust settles, and that would affect the attitude and approach towards the Gulf states. Let me leave it there.
Oh, Hadi, that was remarkable. You took away every question I was about to ask you in this exchange. So moving on to the next round of questions. Dr. Ebtesam, where does the UAE now draw the line between de-escalation and confrontation with Iran, particularly if future attacks, and we're assuming future attacks in the course of the current war between Iran and Israel and the United States, if future attacks threaten Emirati infrastructure and economic stability?
Well, the question I think today is not whether the UAE prefers de-escalation or confrontation with Iran. The answer is to that is well known. Of course, the UAE has consistently preferred de-escalation. The real question is under what condition is de-escalation still possible? Still, we are in we cannot say we are no war, no peace, what we are witnessing. So what the recent attacks have done is fundamentally shift that calculation. For years, the UAE pursued a model built on openness, open trade, open connectivity, open engagement, even with difficult neighbors like Iran. Engagement with Iran was part of that logic. It was never about trust. It was about managing risk in a volatile region. But the attack have exposed a critical vulnerability. When economic openness becomes a target, to stop being just an economic model. It becomes a national security issue. This is where the UAE now draw the line. As long as tensions remain political, rhetorical, or containable, the UAE will continue to de-escalate. It will use diplomacy, back channels, and regional mediation. Geography does not change, and communication with Iran will remain necessary. But if future action directly threaten infrastructure, in ports, airports, energy facilities, shipping routes, or even digital networks that it has been attacked, the equation changed completely. But the future actions directly threaten Emirati infrastructure. This is, you have to know now, this infrastructure, it will be included in the security doctrine. So at that point, the issue is no longer about avoiding escalation. It is about protecting the system that makes the UAE function. And the system is not abstract. It is what makes Dubai a global hub. It is what keeps capital flowing, supply chain moving, and confidence intact. So, what does confrontation mean in the Emirati context? It does not mean rushing into war. That is not how the UAE operates. Instead, it means calibrated but firm shift towards deterrence. Uh, First, immediate defensive escalation. It means strengthening air and missile defense, hardening critical infrastructure, and ensuring rapid response capabilities. Also, the second, deeper security integration with partners, of course, particularly United States, France, and other key actors to ensure that future attack carries higher cost and greater risk for the attacker, also securing maritime routes, economic and legal counter pressure. The UAE has tools that goes beyond the militarily financial networks, regulatory leverage, and international partnership that can impose cost in more sophisticated ways. And finally, controlled signaling, making clear that deterrence has been re-established without triggering uncontrolled escalation. What is important here is that diplomacy does not disappear. It continues, but under different terms. Before the attack, diplomacy aimed to build confidence. After the attack, diplomacy becomes a tool to manage risk under deterrence. So now the question which I would like to ask also, why Iran in the previous war last year did not attack the GCC? It's only send one missile and inform the American, inform the Qataris that is going to send this missile. Why? Now, don't tell me about Israel, okay? Because Israel was a fact from before in its relation with Bahrain, with UAE. This time, Iran, even Oman, attacked. It did not keep anybody from either those whom they are friends or Iran consider them foe. So also this is a question we should ask. What has been changed this time? Both US and the Israeli attack Iran last time. Why this time Iran started attacking us? Before we assured Iran that we are not going to be part of this war. All of us, all the Gulfists, Iran did not stop attacking us. Or even on the day of ceasefire, Iran did not respect that.
Good questions, and perhaps we can find answers as we proceed in this program. Dr. Zeidon, can Qatar and Oman realistically continue a mediation role between Iran and the United States after what has happened? And if so, what do you believe should be the primary interest of the GCC states as they try to mediate a deal between Iran and the US?
Well, mediation isn't just a preference for both Oman and Qatar. It's actually a structural role that serves their national interests if we were to look at their geopolitical engagement in the region. But the space for that role is being narrowed by Iranian attacks, and they know it, and they have publicly admitted it. Particularly Qatar has been more open about it than Oman. And that is why we wonder if they can continue it in the way it has been. But it also depends on what happens during this conflict and how long it will continue for and what deal comes out of it. Now, Qatar and Oman have historically been effective back-channel facilitators precisely because they're not perceived as adversaries by Tehran. But that asset, as we've noticed now, doesn't disappear after an escalation. If anything, it becomes more valuable. But credibility in mediation also requires that both sides to want the channel. The key question here is also whether Washington, particularly the current administration, the Trump's administration, which is a unique one, sees Qatar and Oman as useful facilitators or as obstacles to pressure campaigns. Oman has played this role quietly and consistently since the 1980s, facilitating the 2013 secret US-Iran talks that eventually openly and publicly led to the JCPOA. That institutional knowledge isn't really easily replaced, and a US administration, any US administration should recognize that. Qatar's challenge is a bit more acute. As a US strategic partner and a basing partner, it risks being perceived by Tehran as too close to Washington to be a neutral actor if escalation deepens, and we noticed this since February 28th. Now, the realistic scenario is that both can continue, but their role shifts from active mediation to perhaps message carrying and crisis containment, preventing miscalculation rather than brokering comprehensive agreements. This is still, of course, enormously valuable, right? Because in a high tension environment, having a functioning back channel is the difference between managed escalation and accidental war. Now, to the second part of your question, Ambassador, what GCC states should prioritize in any Iran-US deal? I think five fundamental ways of looking at this. One is regional inclusion, which means not just bilateral outcomes, where the GCC's core fear is obviously a repeat of the original JCPOA, where a US-Iran deal was struck over their heads without addressing the Iranian proxy networks, the missiles programs, or regional behavior. Any deal must include a mechanism for GCC input to ensure that their voice is being heard and their perspective is being recognized. Another point is a sunset clause architecture, where Gulf states need assurances that any deal doesn't simply delay Iranian nuclear capacity and then expire. They should push for either no sunsets or automatic snapback mechanisms with teeth, similarly to the examples we noticed from the Trump's administration, even the first one, in dealing with the Iranian engagement in the region and its relationship with the US. A third one would be the linkage to non-nuclear behavior, where ballistic missiles and proxy forces such as the Houthis or the Iran-backed groups in Iraq or Hezbollah in Lebanon are obviously existential concerns for Gulf states and even existential concerns for the countries hosting these groups. A deal that addresses only the nuclear file while leaving these untouched is obviously unacceptable from all perspectives across the Gulf, but obviously there is different levels of patience depending on their relationships with these host countries, but also depending on the relationship with Iran. And then there's the economic normalization sequences, where Gulf states have an interest in an Iranian economic integration being gradual and conditional, and not a sudden flood of sanctions relief that empowers Tehran's regional projection before behavior change is verified. And finally, perhaps avoiding a security vacuum, where any diplomatic process must be accompanied by a clear US security guarantee to Gulf partners. The lesson Gulf states drew from the 2015 is that diplomatic engagement with Iran must come packaged with compensatory security architecture and not just as a substitute for it. Now, the GCC's collective leverage in this moment is clearly underappreciated as per their perspectives, and they're clearly not passive observers. They are the states that determine whether any US-Iran arrangement is regionally stabilizing or regionally destabilizing. Both Qatar and Oman obviously understand that, as they have tried to play a perspective or provide input on both sides. And this finally makes us, or takes us to the point that the remaining question is whether Washington does too.
Question I can't answer either. Ali, this has been a bad time for Iran's foreign, foreign alliance building. It has lost much of its influence in Syria and Lebanon. It has alienated in one way or another every one of its Gulf state neighbors. And so what does Iran's regional strategy really look like? What are the opportunities for it? And in addition to that, as was mentioned, can Tehran still sustain its proxy-centered alliance model, or is it being forced into some other sort of broader strategic recalibration?
Sure. So look, I think it is important to understand Iran's legitimate security concerns correctly. Otherwise, we will come up with a set of policies that would basically reproduce the same vicious cycle that we have been in, I would say, in the past 4 decades. The reason that Iran opted for a asymmetric means of defense, whether it's in utilizing drones or missiles or mines and speedboats, or its forward defense policy of deploying partners and proxies away from its borders, has always been because of the lack of a viable strategic alternative. And I'm afraid that remains the case even after this war. And in a way, one could argue that the Iranians rediscovered how to use the proxy policy in a much more effective way. We saw for the first time in this war, Hezbollah entering into a war with Israel on behalf of Iran, not based on its own calculations. And we saw Iran insisting on a ceasefire in Lebanon as part of the conditions for its own ceasefire with the United States and Israel. And so you see this concept of unity of all fronts, the Houthis entering into the fray at a strategic moment and basically signaling the next steps in the escalation ladder according to the Iranian plans. So these have demonstrated to the Iranians that not only its regional deterrence and network has not been completely neutralized, but it actually is still essential to its national security. Now, it is understandable that in the aftermath of this war, the Gulf countries would want to see these tools, coercive tools that Iran has used, whether it's control over the Strait of Hormuz, whether it's the use of proxies or Iranian missiles, all of these be curbed and contained in a way that doesn't threaten their interests. The question is, what would the Gulf countries be able to put on the table to reassure the Iranians that they do not need these tools to basically push back against a very hostile Israel and also the United States. And here, I think I haven't really seen much answers from the Gulf countries, which is a mirror image of where we were about a decade ago in the aftermath of the JCPOA negotiations. That the Gulf countries were very clear about the ceiling of Iranian influence in the region, and they wanted to make sure that is limited under a certain threshold. But they never defined the kind of floor that would be tolerable for them of Iranian influence in the region. And so now we're facing the same dilemma, that as long as some of the things that my colleagues talked about happen, deeper relations with the United States, doubling down on relations with a country that engaged in an act of aggression against Iran twice in less than a year in the middle of negotiations, doubling down on that relationship, basically bringing back more US military equipment, deepening ties with Israel, will clearly deepen Iran's threat perception and would push Iran to double down exactly on the same policies that the Gulf countries see as threatening. So that is certainly not the best way forward. I think there is a need to go back to the drawing board, to rethink regional security architecture in a much more inclusive way, not at the expense of any one actor, and try to find win-win formulas. It is understandable that at this point, emotions are still running high, and as I said, the dust has not settled on this conflict. but it is unreasonable to expect a country that has now emerged from a really serious threat to its existence, launched by the mightiest military power in the world and the strongest military in the region, to now disarm itself, or or to give away leverage without reassurance. And let me just end with this point. That if you talk to the Iranians of what were the values or the sort of the benefits of de-escalation with the Gulf countries, they argued that there wasn't much to show, right? That the Saudis never invested in Iran, which is what the Iranians were actually interested in, or all of these Gulf countries. Even if the Iranians believed their arguments that they were discouraging the United States from striking Iran, with all of their influence, especially with this administration, they failed twice. And Benjamin Netanyahu proved to be much more influential than all of the Gulf state leaders combined in influencing U.S. policy. And again, they have all provided bases and support for the United States, even if they really didn't want to do so. The U.S. has used their territory and airspace, just evidenced by the fact that the highest number of U.S. aircraft that was targeted were on GCC territory. The highest number of U.S. casualties are on territories of the Gulf states and nowhere else in the region. So this is why I think we should get out of this kind of zero-sum thinking of how can we contain and deter one actor, but to think about how we can redefine the regional security arrangement in a way that everybody feels that their interests and their security concerns are looked after.
That's an interesting chain of thought as we go forward. I wanted to ask a question that no one has much addressed here. A little bit, Dr. Ebtesam did. If one is to believe Secretary of State Rubio, the United States entered the war because Israel was going to attack Iran anyway, and we had to get into the game to lessen or to, how can I say, restrict escalation and the war spilling over, which clearly failed. I had a number of meetings with attending various conferences in the Gulf, number of meetings with over the years with Gulf officials from, I'd say, virtually every country, who all expressed concern that the Americans were advocating Israel as a security partner against Iran, and the people to whom I spoke were worried about this, about Israel actually dragging the Gulf states into war with Iran. And again, if one is to believe Secretary of State Rubio, that is precisely what they managed to do. Now, generally, in the Arab states and in Iran, there's always been, even if not at the governmental level, a great deal of concern about the future of the Palestinians, which has affected public opinion in these states, despite them all being less than, how can I say, fully democratic receptive to public opinion. Just taking a round, where do you think Israel will end up in the relationship overall, and particularly the security relationship of those countries? Dr. Ebtesam, starting with you.
Ambassador, before answering this question, I want also to comment on what Ali said, how if the Gulfists can assure Iran that Israel or US will not attack Iran. Well, that was beyond GCC. I mean, how can they assure Iran? In fact, they wanted to tame Iran. That's why all these good relation with Iran, not to attack them. And this is what I said in the beginning, trying to de-escalate, to avoid that Iran waging a war against them. Who can? And that I said in the beginning, Iran, why US in the region? Why those Gulfists open their lands for American either bases or soldiers, because Iran is a threat for them, never sending a signal that it will be a normal state, a neighbor they can deal with. They are always, and even those whom they having a good relation with Iran, I mean Oman and Qatar, so always under the threat perception. Now, why the war happened, Ambassador? We know that Netanyahu, to stay in power, he has to go from a war to another. It happened, and that retaliation against Hamas and Gaza, or against Palestinian, then Lebanon war, then other war last year on Iran, then this year. But why Iran is punishing the Gulfies? This is the question. It wanted to raise the cost for the American to stop the war, but using the Gulfies as the shields. Why? This is the question. All of them, they had a good relation, from Kuwait to Oman, Qatar, Saudi, UAE. That is the question. So after, even, I would say, which regime we are going to have after the war? And it will be a friendly regime or a hostile regime? This is also another question, will determine what kind of relation we will have with Iran. Are we going to live all our life under Iranian regime threat? That cannot be. I don't think the Iranian people want that. They want to live a normal life. These, historically, these parts of the Gulf, people moving from this side to other side, intermarriages, immigration, always live in a good relation until this regime came, since the Iranian Revolution. And who started the Iranian regime exporting its revolution to the other side? So let's ask the real question now: who sets the rules of stability in the Gulf? For a long time, Gulf states were seen as operating within frameworks defined by external powers or shaped by regional tensions. But what we are seeing now is different. As my country, UAE, and potentially the other Gulf states are signaling that they are not just participants in regional security. They are co-authored of its rule. It's not only Iranian. And one of those rules is becoming increasingly clear. Economic stability is not separate from security. It is a core of it, and it will be defended accordingly. And we try to engage Iran in that. We try to have Iran with us as benefiting from that economic prosperity.
Dr. Ebtesam, if I could interrupt, unfortunately, we are really running out of time. I did a poor job of calculating the time involved. So we've only got a couple of minutes left. I could ask the Dr. Zeidon and Ali if one, to briefly address your question, to address, if possible, how this can end in a way that would be favorable to peace and stability in the region. And you've got about a minute or two for each of you, I'm afraid. We have run out of time. Dr. Zeidon?
I think there are different priorities and approaches and willingness in how this will end, and that this is perhaps why the war started from the first place. But if we were to narrow it down a bit, making it a bit easier, I think from a GCC perspective, as previously mentioned, an end to the war in a short term is a objective that aligns with all of them, an immediate end to the war. And I think in the long term, they would be much more interested in addressing fundamental arrangements that would ensure the prevention of such an attack to their countries happening again, whether that is to revisit the US security arrangements that were promised from the first place and were institutionalized from the first place, or to revisit their relations with Iran and finally recognize whether it can be considered as a friendly or a challenging neighbor to have in the region. And also consider that there has been challenges in dealing with Iran and the region that goes beyond this war and goes beyond the recognition of Israel instigating this war and pushing the Trump administration in conducting this war. And finally addressing all the issues that Iran and the GCC share with one another. One cannot deny that the proxy influence across the region isn't only a direct threat and a direct issue that is faced by the GCC, it's also causing an issue for the Lebanese state, for the Iraqi state, and for all of these Arab governments that are also finding it challenging in ensuring a stable relationship with their own Arab orbit, with their own GCC neighbors. I know there's always a fear, an international or a regional fear, when we do refer to a much more stronger, unified Arab framework. I don't think the current generation is interested in a radical pan-Arab political school of thought that people were used to from the 60s or the 70s. A much more unified Arab framework would create a much more stronger regional balance that would ensure a regional geopolitical balance between those three main regional actors in the region that we have, which is Israel, Iran, and Turkey. One cannot deny that these are the three most powerful regional actors in the region. Unifying an Arab framework, ensuring that they can share a much more stronger, coordinated, common security and geopolitical and economic interest together would ensure that we can prevent from political developments and conflicts from happening in the future, as they would have enough power and enough framework and enough umbrella that would ensure that they're not weaker and they're not more vulnerable in the future from any regional perceptions and regional ambitions that we've been witnessing for the past few years and decades.
Ali, your colleagues here have now given you about an hour's worth of opportunities to answer. I'm afraid I can't give you that much. So if you could sort of play the wrap up in a couple of minutes. This has been a conversation that I wish could have lasted another hour.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'll be very brief. I think we should look at the approach that Qatar and Saudi Arabia have adopted as a model of how to move forward. The fact that Qatar, having been burned, despite the fact that it was actually doing mediation and put a lot of effort into preventing this exact scenario from happening, and suffered very serious damages to its infrastructure, is still talking about the fact that there needs to be a modus vivendi with Iran in the future. These countries are neighbors and are going to remain neighbors for decades and centuries to come. And so pointing finger and engaging in blame games and expecting one side to give away its security cards without actually putting anything valuable or equivalent in terms of security concessions on the table is just simply not going to work. And also what Saudi Arabia has done as part of the broader mediation, regional mediation group, along with Turkey, Egypt, and Pakistan, which is actually proactive involvement in trying to end this war. It hasn't been successful yet, but the effort is certainly there. And also try to come up with some sort of a new arrangement of what does it mean to come up with some sort of an arrangement that, again, everybody, regardless of their size, the size of their population, the depth of their statehood, their economic model, or their alliance system, would be able to feel safe and secure in. I think that is the best approach. But again, I do want to emphasize we're not there yet because the dust hasn't settled and the emotions are running high.
Well, thank you very much. As I said, I wish we could have continued this going for another hour or two. I hope to see you all again soon. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. You can see this on YouTube as well for those of you that didn't get all of it. And looking forward to the next interesting panel. Thank you all.